A man is lying on the floor of a prison in a Roman colony called Philippi. His back is open. A few hours ago, the city magistrates tore the clothes off him in the public square and had him beaten with rods, not a few strokes, but blow after blow, until the crowd was satisfied. Then they threw him into the inner cell, the deepest room, the one with no light and no air, and they locked his feet into wooden stocks so he could not even shift his weight off the wounds. It is midnight now. He cannot sleep. No one could sleep through that kind of pain. So here is the question. What does a man pray in the dark with his feet in stocks and his blood drying on a stone floor? You already know what you would pray. You would pray to get out. You would pray for the pain to stop, for the door to open, for morning to come, and the magistrates to change their minds. That is what any of us would pray. That is what fear prays. But that is not what this man prays. The other prisoners are awake too, and they hear something they have never heard in this place. They hear singing. The man and his friend are praying out loud and singing hymns to God, and the Greek word for the way the other prisoners listened means they leaned in, straining toward it the way you lean toward a sound you cannot explain. His name is Paul, and he is the most surprising person to pray in the entire Bible. Here is what most people miss about him. Paul wrote more of the New Testament than anyone who ever lived. We quote his teaching constantly. But buried inside those letters are his actual prayers, the moments where he stops teaching the church and starts pleading with God for them. There are 7 of them, and when you lay all 7 side by side, you find something nobody warns you about. Paul almost never prays for the thing you would pray for. This is not a video about how to pray. This is not a video about what Paul believed. This is not a video about words on an old page. This is about what a man asks God for when he stops performing, when the room is dark, and the chains are real, and there is nothing left to prove. And it turns out he asks for the same strange thing over and over that almost no one prays for today. There is one more thing. Near the end, this same man will make a single request. He will make it 3 times, and the God who is about to shake this very prison apart with an earthquake, who can clearly do anything, will look at that request and say no. Paul will spend the rest of his life calling that no the best answer he ever received. We will get to that no. But not yet. To understand what Paul prayed, you have to understand what Paul could have prayed. This was a man with a list of needs longer than yours. He was shipwrecked 3 times. He was whipped with 39 lashes on 5 separate occasions. He was stoned and left for dead outside a city wall. He went hungry, went cold, went sleepless, and spent years of his life in chains. If anyone had earned the right to fill his prayers with personal requests, it was this man. So watch what he actually asks for. Pay attention to this because the pattern starts here and it never breaks. The first prayer is in his letter to the Ephesians. Paul is writing to a church in a city obsessed with power. Ephesus was famous across the ancient world for magic, for spells, for charms, for people paying good money to bend their circumstances their way. Travelers came from everywhere to buy formulas that promised control over sickness, over enemies, over the future. And what does Paul pray for people surrounded by all of that? Not protection, not provision. He prays that the eyes of their heart would be opened. Sit with that phrase, the eyes of your heart. Paul is saying there is a kind of seeing that has nothing to do with your eyes. He prays that they would know the hope they were called to, and the riches waiting for them, and a power he describes as the same power that raised Jesus from the dead. He is not praying that God would change their situation. He is praying that God would change what they can see. Here is the part nobody tells you. To a city that wanted control over the world around them, Paul prayed for sight into the world they couldn't see. That is the first crack in the pattern. Hold that thought. The second prayer comes a little later in the same letter, and Paul does something physical with it. He says, "For this reason I bow my knees before the Father." That detail matters more than it looks. Jews of Paul's day usually prayed standing. When Paul drops to his knees, he is telling you the weight of what he is about to ask. And what does he ask? That they would be strengthened with power in their inner being. Not their outer life, their inner being. the hidden person, the part of you no one sees. He prays that Christ would settle down and live in their hearts, and that they would have the strength is the word he uses, as if this were heavy lifting to grasp how wide and long and high and deep the love of God actually is. Think about who he was writing to. People like Lydia, a wealthy dealer in purple cloth, who had opened her home to a fragile young church. People like Epaphras, a man Paul says literally wrestles in prayer for his congregation. Real people with real businesses and real fear. And Paul's deepest wish for them is not an easier life, it is a stronger interior. But it gets stranger when you find out where the third prayer was written. The third prayer is in Philippians. And Philippians was written from prison, possibly the very kind of cell we started in. This is a man in chains, and listen to what he prays for the people he loves, that your love may abound more and more with knowledge and depth of insight. Stop and feel the strangeness of that. He is the one in chains. If anyone in that relationship needs prayer, it is Paul, and his prayer flows the other direction entirely. He is not asking them to pray him out. He is praying that their love would grow deeper and wiser while he sits in the dark. Remember the man on the prison floor in Philippi singing at midnight while his friend Silas sang beside him? This is the same city. These are the same people. And this is the secret of how a man sings in a cell. He had stopped praying to get out a long time ago. He was praying for something the chains could never touch. 3 prayers in: sight, inner strength, deeper love. Not one request to change the circumstances. And we are only halfway to the strangest one. Before we go to the second half, and the second half is where this gets personal, let me ask you something. Have you noticed the pattern yet? 3 prayers, and not once has Paul asked God to fix a single circumstance. If that is landing on you the way it landed on me the first time, do 2 quick things. Subscribe so the next prayer doesn't slip past you. And drop 1 word in the comments right now, the one thing you keep praying for God to change. Just 1 word. We'll come back to that word before this is over. Now, the next prayer is going to take a turn into something much darker. Stay with me. The 4th prayer is in Colossians, and at first it sounds like more of the same. Paul prays that this church would be filled with the knowledge of God's will, that they would grow, that they would bear fruit. Familiar territory. But then he asks for one thing that should stop you cold. He prays that they would be strengthened with all power, and you brace yourself because in your world, power is for doing something big. Power is for winning. And Paul finishes the sentence, strengthened with all power for great endurance and patience. Read that again. He asked God for power. And the thing he wanted the power for was the ability to wait, to endure, to stay standing when everything in you wants to sit down. That is not the prayer of a man trying to escape his life. That is the prayer of a man trying to survive it without becoming bitter. And behind this letter is a name worth knowing. Epaphras. He was the one who first carried the good news to Colossae, and Paul says something staggering about him, that Epaphras is always wrestling in prayer for them. The word is the one you'd use for a wrestler straining against an opponent, muscle against muscle. There were men in the early church who prayed until it cost them something. And here is what most people miss. Paul wasn't the only one praying these strange prayers. He had taught a whole generation to pray the way he prayed. His strange prayers were contagious. The 5th prayer softens, and you can feel Paul's guard come all the way down. It's in 1 Thessalonians, and he prays that God would make their love increase and overflow for each other. That's it. That's the whole request. Overflow. This is the same Paul who could be ferocious in an argument, the man who once stood on a hill in Athens and out-reasoned the trained philosophers of his day, quoting their own poets back to them. And here he sounds like a father. In fact, that's exactly the image he reaches for in these letters. He talks about young Timothy the protege he treated like a son. He writes to whole churches as if they were children he was aching to see again. Pay attention to this. The deeper Paul's love runs, the simpler his prayers get. He stops asking for things and just asks for more love. More. Overflow. And then you reach the sixth prayer, and everything you thought you understood about this man cracks open. It's in Romans, and it is the darkest sentence Paul ever wrote. He is praying about his own people, the Jewish nation he came from, the people who by and large had rejected the message he gave his life to. And here is what he prays. He says he has great sorrow and unceasing anguish in his heart. Then he says something almost too heavy to read out loud, that he could wish himself cursed and cut off from Christ if it would save them. Stop. Understand what he is offering. Paul's entire life, his whole hope, his one treasure was being joined to Christ. And he just said he would give that up. He would walk into the dark himself, away from everything he loved, if it meant his people could be saved. This is not a tidy prayer. This is not a polite prayer. This is not a safe prayer. This is a man so broken over the people he loves that he offers God the one thing he could never get back. And notice what is missing even here, even at the bottom. He still isn't praying for himself. At the lowest point in all his letters, his prayer is still pointed away from his own comfort and straight at someone else's soul. 6 prayers now. Sight, inner strength, deeper love, power to endure, overflowing love, and a grief so deep he would trade his own salvation. Do you see it? Every single prayer reaches past the circumstances and grabs for something underneath them. Something the world can't give and chains can't take. Which brings us to the 7th prayer, the one where Paul finally asks God to take something away, and God says no. To understand the 7th prayer, you have to know what happened to Paul right before it. He had been given a vision. He says he was caught up into the 3rd heaven, into paradise, and shown things so holy he wasn't permitted to repeat them. It was the spiritual high point of his entire life. And right after the highest moment he ever had, something arrived to drag him low. He calls it a thorn in the flesh. Now when you hear the word thorn, you picture a splinter, a rosebush prick, a small annoying thing. But that is not the word Paul used. The Greek word is skolops, and in the ancient world it didn't mean a splinter at all. It meant a sharpened stake, the kind of spike a body could be impaled on, the kind they mounted a severed head on after a battle. When Paul reached for a word to describe his suffering, he reached for the image of being run through. We don't know exactly what it was. People have guessed for 2,000 years, a disease, failing eyesight, a tormenting enemy, a relentless temptation he couldn't shake. Paul never says. And maybe that silence is mercy, because it means anyone carrying anything can sit down inside this story. Your thorn fits where his is missing. Here is what he does tell us. He prayed about it. And for once, just this once in all his letters, Paul prayed the prayer you and I pray. He asked God to take it away. He asked 3 times. 3. The early church noticed that number because it is the same number of times Jesus prayed in the Garden of Gethsemane on the night before the cross, falling on his face asking the Father to let the cup pass from him. Paul's 3 pleas weren't casual. They were Gethsemane prayers. They were the prayers of a man at the absolute end of himself, begging the God who split open a prison in Philippi with an earthquake, the God who could obviously, easily, instantly remove this to just make it stop. And here is the answer. Here is the moment we have been walking toward this whole time. God said no. Not wait, not soon, no. The thorn stayed. But God did not leave Paul with only a no. He gave him a sentence, a handful of words that would outlive the Roman Empire. My grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. Look closely at the word sufficient, because the tense is the whole secret. In the Greek, it isn't, my grace will be enough someday. It is present, ongoing, standing. My grace is sufficient right now, continuously, a supply that never runs dry. God wasn't promising to fix the situation later. He was promising to be enough inside it forever. And suddenly every prayer in this video snaps into focus. Think about a parent for a moment. A child stands in the kitchen and asks for the one thing they want most, and the parent says no. Not because the parent is cold, not because the parent didn't hear, But because the parent can see a whole life, the child cannot see. And inside that no there is a deeper yes, the child is too small to understand yet. The no isn't the absence of love. The no is the love wearing a face the child won't recognize until much later. That is what Paul finally understood on the far side of his unanswered prayer. He had spent his whole ministry praying for other people to receive sight, inner strength, endurance, a grace that doesn't depend on circumstances. And it turns out he was praying for them, the very thing God was busy working into him through a wound that would not heal. The thorn was the answer to every prayer Paul had ever prayed. So he stopped asking God to remove it. And he wrote the most unthinkable line of his life, that he would now boast about his weakness, even delight in it, because when he was weak, that was exactly when the power of Christ came down and rested on him. The stake meant to impale him became the place God chose to live. That is the no Paul spent the rest of his life calling the best answer he ever received. So let me give you 3 things to carry out of this. First, the fact. Across all 7 of his prayers, Paul almost never asked God to change his circumstances. He asked for sight. He asked for inner strength. He asked for love that runs deeper and endurance that lasts longer. He prayed for the things that grow underneath a life, not the things that decorate the outside of one. That is the hidden theology nobody teaches, that the most prayed for man in the Bible barely prayed for what we spend most of our prayers on. Second, the part that's about you. Go back to that word you typed in the comments, the one thing you keep asking God to change. There is nothing wrong with that prayer. Paul prayed it too 3 times on his knees. But here is the question his life puts to you. What if while you have been asking God to remove the thorn, God has been trying to give you something the thorn was the only way to deliver? What if the answer to your prayer is not the thing leaving, but you, becoming someone who no longer needs it gone to be okay? And third, the one I can't stop thinking about. Grace was the thing Paul never thought to ask for. He asked for the thorn to go. God gave him grace instead. And by the end, Paul wouldn't have traded that grace for 10,000 answered prayers. The deepest gift of his whole life came in through the door of an unanswered request. The no was the yes. He just couldn't see it from the kitchen floor, which brings us all the way back to where we started. A man on the floor of a prison in Philippi, his back torn open, his feet in stocks, singing at midnight. There was a jailer asleep upstairs who would wake before dawn, ready to fall on his own sword, and who would instead fall on his knees and ask how to be saved, all because 2 beaten men chose to sing instead of scream. Now you know why Paul could sing. He wasn't waiting for the door to open. He had already met the grace that was sufficient, and a man who has that doesn't need the chains removed to be free. So here is my question for you, and I really do want your answer. Which of Paul's 7 prayers do you most need to start praying instead of the one you've been praying? Tell me below. I read them. And the next time you are on the floor in the dark, asking God to take something away, remember the man who got a no and called it the best answer of his life.